Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring voices from the Valley to bear on some of the most complex social issues at the forefront of public discussion and private debate. Today, I'm joined by Professor Preston Smith, who is a professor of politics and the chair of Africana Studies at Met Holyoke. We're going to be talking about the United States' failing cities. Preston, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, pleased to be here.
So, when Detroit declared bankruptcy over the summer, it was one of 8 cities since 2010 that had done so, including cities like Stockton, California, and Central Falls, Rhode Island. What happened in Detroit?
Well, I think to really understand what happened to Detroit and other cities, you have to take both a long-term and a short-term view. The long-term view has to do with national economic and housing policies which have disinvested in our central cities and reinvested in suburbs. So the economic policy made it easier for corporations to relocate their industries, first in the suburban periphery, and then later to the Southwest, and then beyond the borders of the United States. The housing policies facilitated the movement of middle class and whites to move to our suburbs, basically through subsidized loans and also through the highway, this construction of highway, which made it easier. And that policy also was discriminating against African Americans, which made it difficult for them to follow. So as a result of those long-term trends, you set up a situation of economic and racial segregation, where the poor and minorities are centrally located in cities. Middle-class whites are able to live and thrive in the suburban area. The cities and the suburbs have different tax bases, and so with the loss of revenue with business and also with high-income residents, it severely constrained the ability of revenue generation within the city, and at the same time you had a poor population that was either unemployed or underemployed, made it difficult to to generate this revenue through taxes. That set up a kind of fiscal constraints and fiscal pressure on central cities, and this began to happen in the 1950s and 1960s. The more short-term causes is the Great Recession. And not only that sort of economic crisis, but more importantly, the political response to that crisis. So you had first the crisis that was caused largely through mortgage banks and mortgage companies taking advantage of working class and poor folks who want to realize the American dream by buying a single-family home, but did so under terms that were predatory. And so with the crisis and that situation causing foreclosure, what happened is the political response was to bail out the banks because the fragility of the world economic system, financial system, and basically leave the homeowners on their own. And so with that, you have, again, a more severe restriction, and in fact, you have a kind of de facto austerity plan because the federal government, which was President Obama and his administration, as liberals sort of bowed to the pressure of conservatives who wanted to cut spending in a response to a recession which many people, including Paul Krugman and other Keynesians, thought was idiotic and thought it was, in fact, has really slowed the recovery that we currently have. It's not as robust as it could have been. And at the same time, you didn't provide relief for those homeowners, and you didn't, provide relief for those local governments who had to cut payroll in order to manage and meet their budgets. So there's a long-term trends that cause, class and race segregation, and then that was exacerbated by the Great Recession in terms of the kind of political response that really made it much more difficult for cities to balance their budgets.
Failing cities are defined as those who don't have a prospect of returning to their former prosperity. How can the richest country in the world have so many failing cities?
Well, again, I think this has a lot to do with our priorities, has a lot to do with what I just talked about in terms of the response to that recession and basically not, it really responds to the kind of federalist political structure that we have. So we have a political structure that, in a sense, in the process of devolution, has put more and more responsibilities on cities than, in fact, they have the resources and able to respond to. And it's sort of off the political agenda or table to be able to give more local aid coming from states who are also constrained, but mostly coming from the federal government. And so that is put, again, severe constraints on cities. And I think in that regard, as opposed to European countries where some other cities are more, they're not as dependent on local resources, but on more national resources. It has put our cities in a particular precarious situation in terms of being able to, have very little opportunity to generate the revenue that they need, and it's sort of in a kind of death spiral, if you will. Once you start to cut essential services, people leave, then you lose your tax base, and so that is, I think, caused a kind of spate of municipal bankruptcies that we've seen. In fact, from 2000 to 2010, which this has to do, again, with foreclosures, we've seen really 4.5 million homes, housing units foreclose, and about 44% during that time. So that, again, without property taxes, that restricts, again, that budget. And then people who pay sales taxes, which are one of two largest sources of revenue, make it very difficult for our cities to survive.
As a faculty member at Mount Holyoke, I know that you live our mission of using liberal learning for purposeful engagement in the world. If you were to advise the mayor of Holyoke or other public officials in Western Massachusetts, how can they prevent Holyoke from having the same fate as Detroit and other failing cities?
Well, I think that's it's a tall task to be able to withstand or to be able to adequately confront a really terrible structural position. I mean, I think that because of our federalist system, the problems are created by national policy. They're created by economic policy. They're created by housing policy. They're created by the cutback, just more recently, in food stamps by a Republican Congress. So those policies and those decisions are not made in City Hall in Holyoke or Springfield or Chicopee. They're made in Washington. And so the problems are created nationally, but the solutions are expected to be engineered or directed from the local government. So they're in a really tough position. And unfortunately, what has happened is that they have, in order to rectify their situation, is they've had to attract more capital, more people, businesses, and people who can help to bolster that tax base. And in doing so, sometimes they had to do tax giveaways to attract business. And so that contributed almost to a race to the bottom with other cities, because they're competing with other cities. And then so therefore you're giving up revenue to get, hopefully, jobs. And unfortunately, they never get the number of jobs that are promised. So that's one problem. The other problem, or other way, has been gentrification. So you basically allow for an upper middle class, upper class, or upper income citizens to move into the city and to hope to regenerate inner city neighborhoods, but in the process often displace poor and working class residents. And in doing so, you're trying to attract, again, more revenue, but you've created a situation where some of your citizens are hurt by those policies. So I think one possible opportunity, and it's not a great opportunity, is that with some cities, because of depopulation, there might be a possibility to attract that upper income citizen base, but also maintain affordable housing, maintain good quality services, for your working class and poor citizens that are still there, and to have them, what we hope would be in a democracy, a multiracial and a multi-class citizenry. But that's tough because once you start the process of particularly gentrification, it's hard to stop it where it doesn't end up making it difficult for someone to find affordable housing, certainly within the confines of one city. So it's really, you know, they're in a tough position, and I know that many of them are trying to be creative about that process and mindful of its effects, but I guess that would be the way, is to try to manage gentrification in a way that limited the impact, limited the displacement of the poor citizens, the poorer citizens and working class citizens within those cities.
Before Detroit filed bankruptcy, there was a push by city officials to garner revenue from the casinos. What role do you think casinos play in revitalizing cities? Do you see a place for them in Western Massachusetts?
Well, it seems so far that the citizens are opposing casinos and throughout the Commonwealth. So, and I think that's wise on their part. I mean, again, you have cities who don't have a lot of good choices for economic development, and so casinos have been sort of seized upon as the sort of best choice. And what you often get with casinos is not really good jobs. So you just add those jobs to the really spate of low-wage service jobs already in the city. So you're contributing to underemployment. And you also invite a number of social problems to your city, not to mention sort of gambling addiction, but all kinds of traffic congestion, all kinds of problems that have to do with organized crime or public safety sorts of issues. So they don't seem to me to be the right solution for cities. But I also know that they're often seized upon because there's not a lot of options out there.
Tell me about the role of unions in cities.
Well, I think that in this process, particularly with Detroit and other bankruptcies, that's where the focus has gone, particularly often too much with the mainstream media. I mean, I think it's an opportunity with bankruptcy to, they think, first of all, paint the picture of municipal employees who were promised these pensions as a result of getting less money at the time compared to private sector jobs, and with the idea that one day would be able to retire. It seems to be, to me, morally bankrupt to then turn around and say, no, you can't have what we promised. And so a lot of blame has been on municipal workers, municipal unions, and in fact, some would argue that at least within either in state capitals or within cities, that they are actually taking advantage of the fiscal crisis in order to undercut the power of municipal unions and particularly the livelihoods of municipal workers, particularly in their retirement. And so I think that's unfortunate. And it seems to me that if, again, instead of looking at the sort of lack of fiscal revenue and resources at the local level, is say that we have to pit, in a sense, current citizens who are working versus those who are on pension. Rather than pitting those two together, we should be thinking about what are the ways in which our national government, what are the ways in which we as a society can support our fellow Americans and support our cities, because they are often still the engines of economic growth within our society. Every study has said that the metropolitan area that provided more integration, certainly through class and race, between the central city and the suburbs have been the more prosperous. And so in that way, I think that that's the way to look, instead of targeting and scapegoating municipal unions.
So in 1940, the Supreme Court ruled in Hansberry versus Lee that restrictive covenants were impermissible. Those devices that were intended to prevent integration. And this opened the door for legislators to established anti-discrimination in housing legislation. So why is it that we are where we are today with increasing segregation in urban areas? And what can we do to redress this?
Well, it's a very, very difficult problem. It's one we have, been living with for a long time. The end of restrictive covenants with the 1940 Act and also the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer Act, Supreme Court decision. It outlawed basically the legal, the government's reinforcement or endorsement of private discrimination. But unfortunately, we still have other discriminatory devices and policies. So I think the chief sort of problem, I think, is the way in which racial segregation coincides with class segregation and economic segregation. And until we solve economic segregation, we're not going to solve completely racial segregation. So that would be the first thing I have to say. And so all the things I've talked about in terms of trying to balance and reintegrate central cities with suburbs, in terms of transportation systems, in terms of our educational systems, which are completely separate, we're not going to solve that racial segregation. Now, in addition to looking at and focusing on economic segregation, we need to do something about, after 1968, with the Civil Rights Bill, which was the first fair housing bill, there was a decision made that the government wouldn't have enforcement or police powers to basically bring suit against private discriminators, and it was going to be in some cases given to third-party or nonprofit or third sector organizations. So I would change that, or attempt to change that, and to give the Justice Department and state governments and local governments more enforcement power to try to counteract incidents of discrimination, of housing discrimination, and really a more robust anti-discriminatory policy. But again, that's only going to, it's going to help, but until we change political ethos and change discourse about the fact that in this society we're in it together, and that unless we can also sell the idea or that we once had at one particular time, but we haven't had in the last 30 or 40 years, that we all can learn from each other, and we can best learn from each other if we're living in the same communities and going to the same schools. I think that's what we need to do in terms of getting citizens to support this class and race integration.
There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education recently that pointed to research claiming that our cities have really become police states with young people of color, in particular, either under the control of the prison system, probation, or parole. To what do you attribute this trend, and is there something that we can do to reverse it?
Well, it's the logical extension of that complete separation or isolation of the central city from the more prosperous suburbs. And of course, not all suburbs are doing well, but from the more sort of, communities that are producing jobs, producing good housing. Once you do that, and once you restrict economic opportunity in terms of jobs within the central city, or at least access for those who live in the central city, you also have been underinvesting in education, and now we're in a trend of privatization of education through charter schools and others. By doing that, you are eliminating or making it very difficult for our fellow citizens in central cities to have access to economic opportunity. And so by doing that, you raise the possibility of people engaging in crime in order to, take advantage, to get access to income. So what we've done, one of the responses to this really sort of extreme economic segregation is to put our police in a situation of controlling a situation that has of people in poverty and people responding to that poverty to try to keep order. And they've done so in ways that I wouldn't always endorse. I think it set up a situation, in fact, of feeling like an occupation, feeling like that the police are not there to serve the working class and citizens of color within inner cities, but in fact to contain them, police them, and eventually move them on into prisons. And there's been a number of scholars who've talked about whether it's the schools to prison pipeline, but that because of these changes, there's really been the line between the ghettos, if you will, the inner city, and prisons have been almost erased or quite porous in the way in which our schools often look like prisons, and the ways in which we've populated prisons with younger people unfortunately, through the drug laws. There's been, in a sense, the response to social or economic insecurity, the response to a devaluing of social welfare, whether it's through TANF or through the cut in food stamps, is to, on one hand, police the situation or to force people into workfare and basically really strict disciplinary policy. So that's not going to change. And again, I hate to sort of keep harping on this, but it's not going to change unless we really get at the structural roots of that situation. And the structural roots have to do with we need to find ways for our national and our state governments to reinvest in our central cities, and then again integrate those central cities with the suburban towns and cities around them.
In their groundbreaking book, Black Metropolis, Sinclair Drake and Horace Caton talk about the Great Migration of blacks from the South to Chicago, the New Chicago Renaissance, and then what happened between World War I and World War II to the populations of Chicago. Your work, Racial Democracy and the Black Metropolis, is equally significant, I think, in bringing class into that debate. Talk for 2 minutes about your work and its impact on the debates over our failing cities.
Sure. Well, my book really looks at housing policy, and the ways in which I've talked about national housing policy and the position that black elites, policy elites, those who headed the NAACP or the Urban League or worked in the federal government in housing agencies, the way they thought about, they were great in terms of pointing out and trying to confront racial segregation and racial discrimination, but at the same time, they accommodated, if you will, the larger role of the real estate industry in determining what was going to be built and where it was going to be built. So, mind you, the power real estate industry was quite large and much larger than these black policy elites. I'm not trying to say that they had the ability to stop them, but unfortunately, by not through their discourse and through their policy proposals, pointing out and confronting that class segregation, they end up legitimating it. And so what we have is, unfortunately, a flowering of the inattention, not just by black policy elites, but by all elites, and certainly liberal elites as well, that inattention to class segregation, we are now suffering the consequences of that inattention. So my book is really looking at the debates amongst black policy elites over housing policies and the ways in which their racial policies and their racial priorities in many ways met their class interests and met the class interests of their larger black middle class public.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Your book was fascinating. I enjoyed reading it, and we really appreciate your taking the time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.